Actually, can I get some water?
Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Start serving here. And just let me know if you want. So, welcome, and especially to you. It's a privilege to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. And as you can see, it's a lot of people who came to listen to you. And I know you also had a lot of interviews already today, a lot of press and so on. And like Hannah said, it will be, I'm sure, some questions in the end. And but I will start with, as everyone already know, you're a writer, you're a journalist, a broadcaster, and readers might know about you from The Observer and The Guardian. But actually you have been published also in Swedish newspapers, Göteborgs-Posten and Svenska Dagbladet, a number of articles actually. And we're going to talk about your book, but which is fantastic, by the way. But before we begin, you are born in India and brought up in Manchester. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your background and how, or if so, it sort of shaped your political outlook.
Well, I grew up in a Britain that's very different from the Britain of today. It was a Britain that was deeply, viscerally racist. A Britain where race attacks, arson attacks, stabbings, murders were common. And if you were black or Asian, you wouldn't go to the police, because the first thing the police would do is arrest you rather than the perpetrator. It's a very different Britain. Britain's changed enormously over the past 30, 40 years. Did it shape my outlook? Clearly, knowing about racism, being at the end of racism, necessarily shapes the way you look at it. But of course, the fact that you are subject to racism doesn't mean that you have the same answers about racism, or what racism is, what race is. There are people who, most people I suppose, who write on this disagree with a lot of what I write on it. I mean, I grew up on the left, but a left that was already changing. I've talked about the Rushdie affair as being a kind of watershed, both for British society and for myself. I lost a lot of friends during the Rushdie affair, people who, like me, were on the left, but who supported the campaign against Salman Rushdie because they saw it as a way of defending the dignities of their communities and so on. And in many ways, what the Rushdie affair did was bring to the surface a lot of the issues that have dominated politics since. Islam, Islamism, multiculturalism, free speech, and so on, those kinds of issues. But it also signalled a series of trends that were already happening on the left in particular, where the left was moving away from a more universalist perspective to a more, what we'd call more particularist perspective, what we now call the politics of identity. And long before it was fashionable to do so, I was a critic of the politics of identity. And a lot of my campaigning, my writing since then has been about defending or reformulating ideas about universalism in a way that makes sense to a very different age. Reformulating old-fashioned ideas, what are now seen as old-fashioned ideas of the left, from universalism to free speech, for instance, but in a way that to a very different world, trying to find a language where we can talk about, or where I can talk about class, for instance, class politics in a way that doesn't make sense these days to most people.
As you already know, and I know that you know this because it's sort of a starting point in your book, today it's a tendency to look at issues as they are, also right here, right now, at the present. And instead, in general, we need to look, it's important to use historical perspectives, or to place issues in a broader frame. And sometimes we talk about our broad present. And I think that term was introduced by the German thinker Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht. My German isn't so good, but he's a professor in literature at Stanford. And what he means is, with that term, is that we live close to the recent past. The present are sort of entangled into the present. And when I teach, or when I try to market history, the importance of history, I use a rather more pedagogical tool, but or a metaphor. I used to say that one can compare it with driving a car. To drive a car, it's not necessary. You should look in front of you, but that's not enough. You also must need to look in the rear mirror, because you need to know what comes in the back. And I think that your book is sort of a brilliant example of doing that, because you discuss a present problem or issue, but from a historical perspective. And the title also lives up, the book lives up to the title, because it gives us a more complex history. So if we start from the start there with the historical perspective and then move on to today. A central argument in the book is race did not give birth to racism. Racism gave birth to race. So can you unpack that for us?
Sure. It's true that when most people think about racism, they assume that racism arises when races collide, that when one race meets another, discriminates against the second race, that's the roots of racism. And in a way, I turn that argument on its head. The ancestors of today's African Americans were not enslaved because they were black. They became deemed as black and inferior as a way of justifying and legitimizing their enslavement. Why did their enslavement need to be legitimized and justified? Because for most of human history, slavery, inequality, the views of different people as subhuman were seen as just part of the world, were seen as natural. We forget how recent notions of equality and of a common humanity have become foundational to our societies. But that's what transforms the way we look at different groups, because racial inequality and racial difference only has meaning within societies that have already accepted notions of equality and a common humanity. And that's what we see arising from the 18th century onwards. So, the French Revolution, rooted in the idea of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the American Declaration of Independence, at the heart of which is the belief that all humans are equal. Except that these societies, which had an abstract belief in equality, in practice were deeply unequal. Not just slavery, colonialism, racism, or the treatment of women, treatment of working class people. All these were deep inequalities in societies that proclaimed their equality. And race develops from the 17th, 18th century onwards as a way of bridging that chasm between an abstract belief in equality and the reality of deeply unequal societies. Because what race says is that certain groups of people are by definition, are by nature, incapable of being equal or incapable of accessing liberty. That equality and liberty should be the privilege of only certain groups. It is what's also interesting here is that if you look at the way Europeans thought about race and racial difference in the 19th century, was very different from the way we think about ideas of race. I mean, when we talk about race, we talk about race largely in terms of skin color or continent of origin, white, black, Asian, and so on. But in the 19th century, while Africans and Asians were seen as racially inferior by Europeans, so were the working class. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but for 19th century writers, plumbers or factory hands were as distinct, as inferior from middle-class people as many now see blacks and whites as distinct. They were racially, anthropologically, physically distinct. And race develops in a much broader context than we imagine now. And it develops as a way of explaining inequality in societies that have a profound, abstract, but nevertheless foundational attachment to equality.
But can you compare that so that we have a sort of historical amnesia?
We do have a historical amnesia. We forget how the way that race was used in the 19th century, the way that the working class was seen in the 19th century. There were hundreds of scientific studies which showed that the working class have different types of heads to different types of skulls to the middle class, that they were physiologically, anatomically distinct from middle-class people. It's hard for us to imagine that because we live in such a different society. But it is historical amnesia. And what people called white was also something that develops over time. Theodore Allen, the historian of whiteness, the first historian of whiteness in many ways, he makes a point that when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1620, nobody thought of themselves as white. They didn't think of themselves as white because white was not a category that they recognized. They thought of themselves as English. Or descendants of the English, but not as white. White develops over time in relation to blackness, actually, in relation to defining Africans as black and therefore unworthy of equality. And many groups we now think of as white were certainly not thought of as white in the 19th century. Initially, the Irish, for instance, Slavs, East Europeans, Southern Europeans, and most notably Jews, who didn't acquire whiteness in America, for instance, until the post-Holocaust period. So there's a kind of development, a shift in the character of race. And the contemporary notion of race only emerges in the early 20th century for two reasons. One was the coming of democracy at home, the spread of universal suffrage, so that by the early 20th century, most Western nations had some form of universal suffrage. And it was much more difficult to explicitly think of the working classes racially inferior when you want their votes. And the second aspect was the spread of the new imperialism from the 1880s onwards, the land grab in Africa and in the Pacific. And the two coming together transformed the way we think about race and created what Du Bois calls the colour line as a principal divide within racial thinking.
And you, Nathan, you have also been writing about race. Do you have any thoughts?
I have a small caveat here. I think you're underselling this idea even. I mean, if you take Sweden, for instance, the whole Sweden stands out a bit, but these are common European features to have all that. I mean, from eugenics to all those kind of the disciplinary characters of the state was so violently pushed towards working classes, but also, I mean, it was a bit of a mosaic. So Sami people, to a certain extent, Finnish people, Roma people, Jews that bore the brunt of that. But I would just say that also didn't really shift until 1945. I mean, whoever was seen as a vagabond. I mean, there were all these disciplinary laws that originally were formed to just maintain order and keep the social hierarchies intact. But they had racial features in Sweden until, I would say, at least the 30s, the mid-30s. And that's where it was like a conscious political invention, or intervention rather, to go in the opposite direction of how continental fascism went, but still addressing a kind of... They had some left-wing nationalist features, but it was a bit more inclusive. But I wouldn't... I mean, if you take Roma people, Sweden didn't stop racial discrimination of Roma people until the 60s at least. And I mean, I agree, generally, it's just very important to have that in mind, how elastic, or the elasticity of racism. Yeah. And that's also the reason, because so often people talk about it as if it's some debris that we've inherited from the past. And we can't fathom that it's quite possible to construct new racial categories and ideas or concepts today. And I would say it's done. I guess that's what we're getting at when inadvertently, from a kind of benevolent mindset, you can end up there where you're trying to address racial discrimination.
If we slowly move forward, if race has no grounding in science, why do you think the idea of race is so prevailing or persistent today? I mean, we have seen a lot of progress, but still we talk a lot about race today. And you write about this as some sort of paradox. Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, the paradox, and it's a paradox that's at the heart of the book, is something like this. We all live in societies, certainly in the West, that have a profound moral abhorrence of racism, albeit that in most countries, large groups of people have their lives disfigured by racism. Nevertheless, at a moral level, there is an abhorrence of racism. At the same time, we're obsessed with putting people into racial and ethnic boxes and defining people, their needs, their aspirations, their values, and so on, by the boxes into which we put them. And it's as if the more we despise racism, the more we cling on to racial forms of thinking. And part of what the book addresses is why we've ended up with this paradox by looking at the kind of historical shifts that have taken place. I think, one of the key, there are two key shifts that have taken place in the post-war years that are important as an aspect of this. The first is the shift from a racial view of the world to a cultural view of the world. In the post-war, post-Holocaust, post-Nazi era, it was much more difficult to define human differences in racial terms. I mean, we continued, of course, but culture became the predominant medium through which we looked at human differences. Ideas about ethnic pluralism and multiculturalism come into fashion. But the culture, our concept of culture, is often very little different from the old concept of race, in the sense that it's culture that people belong to distinct cultures, that each individual is shaped, defined by the culture to which they belong, that cultural differences matter more than human commonalities. And in a way, the distinction between a cultural and a racial view of the world was that in a racial view of the world, the human essence, the essence of a particular group, not the human essence, but the group's essence, was carried by biology. And that different groups had different essential qualities because of their biological differences. In a cultural view of the world, that essence is carried by history, and that different groups have different cultural essences because of their different historical trajectories. It's the argument that now you see many on the right, not just the far right, but many on the right, some on the left make, that immigrants don't belong because they don't have that same history and heritage, and therefore they can't have the same values as white people do. That there is something called the European homeland that's being sullied by immigration. That a city like London, or I assume Stockholm or Malmo, are losing their whiteness, and that's a tragedy. And so on. I mean, these have become commonplace, not just on the far right, but on mainstream right discussions too. And you can see there where culture and race become mixed, and they've become mixed on the left too, where the blackness is both a cultural and a racial category, for instance, or we think about Muslims as both somehow culturally distinct, but also in a way racially distinct too. So that's one aspect of the shift that explains how racial ideas come carried through, because they're carried through our notions of culture. The other shift is the rise of what I'd call social pessimism, a kind of a radical universalist perspective requires us to believe that it's possible to transform society radically and for the better. And in many ways, we've lost that perception, that belief over the past 30, 40 years, because the old radical movements have largely disappeared. The working class has lost influence, trade unions have lost influence, the left has lost influence, and so on. And so people have become, people cling on to then narrower identities, which are often ethnic or racial, but not necessarily so, because this applies to all forms of identity politics, as a kind of refuge, as a kind of place to be in a way, in a world that seems that you cannot change otherwise. And so, in that context, racial categorization becomes so much more important. For instance, take something like critical race theory, which has become a topic of hot debate. There are good critiques and really bloody awful critiques of critical race theory. But one of the things that's most missed out is the fact that critical race theory is a product of that pessimism. I tell a story of Derek Bell, who you probably don't know, in fact most Americans don't know, but he's one of the most important figures in the creation of critical race theory. He was an African-American lawyer. He worked for, at that time, in the 1950s, for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which the NAACP, which was the main African-American organization, civil rights organization. And he, his job was to help desegregate schools in the South. And he became so disillusioned with the whole process that he came to believe that racism was ineradicable, that it will always be there, that for African Americans to imagine that they will get equality was to delude themselves and to cause them great mental harm. And if you read a writer, a contemporary writer like Ta-Nehisi Coates, is probably the most influential African American writer in America. He argues that racism is like a natural disaster, like an earthquake or a typhoon. And he says, just as no law, no social movement can stop an earthquake or a typhoon, neither can it stop racism. And so we live in an age in which, on the one hand, we have this kind of deep belief that racism is ineradicable, but nevertheless needs to be fought. And that necessarily changes the nature of anti-racism, because it changes anti-racism from being something that is material to something that becomes symbolic or gestural, or trying to elicit guilt from white people. So the whole thing, racism becomes reduced to black and white, because it's become something that will always be there, but we need to make the unfairness a bit less unfair. And that's the problem with anti-racism today, I think.
You, on the other hand.
Yeah, me on the other hand.
Hang on.
No.
I think you have a slightly different approach, and I know that you have said that we must see identities before we can loosen them up, and that you have a different. Do you have a different view on critical race theory? Speaking of that,
I don't think so. I think it's just that my entry point is a bit different. But I think I have the same conclusion. But I would stress that just to back it up to what you're saying about culture, I think one of the problems is that, it's like Raymond Williams said sometime, that culture is one of the 2-3 most complicated words in the English language, because we mean so radically different things. And I think we could deconstruct. I think the only way to combat racism, well, for one thing, I do believe in a good old-fashioned left-wing politics. That is universalist. But second of all, on a conceptual level, we have to sort of override this ethnic view of what culture is by imbuing a plethora of identities and cultures, because everybody does not have one identity, but a multitude. And people, I mean, so if a certain segment of society are only deemed through the prism of one lens, you are Muslims or you are Jews, or once we start thinking, and you are bloody Hamelberg supporters, well, that was a very harsh expression in Swedish. But if you'd say, but we are all AIK-are, we are all rooting for, well, sort of like, well, we're Liverpoolians, you know. Or we have, I mean, all the different commonalities that we have, then we deconstruct this privileging of an ethnic definition of culture, which is, I agree totally, it's basically emperor's new clothes of race as a concept. But it is arguably even more complex because you can tie in a lot of more notions to this ethnic definition of what culture is. And especially, I mean, I think what you really nail is the essentialism. That is the problem we have to address. That's where we might differ, but I'm thinking of how do we constructively break up this essentialism. And you referred to the Rushdie affair. There are probably quite a few more, but I can see that where people end up in a kind of, well, it's just trench warfare, where sometimes people are standing on the absolute wrong hill to defend an indefensible position because it feels less radical to shift. And that's what, I mean, when you talk about that pessimism, I see it all the time in kind of shouting wars online, where people seem to imagine that the most pessimistic view is inherently the most radical. And the optimistic is somehow being naive or being bourgeois or being, you know, which is, it's a kind of self-perpetuating view, because of course if you are totally pessimistic, then if you cannot conceive any action or a line of action that would advance positions, it's self-serving.
You can also see that in the celebration of cynicism, which is another aspect of the same thing. Can I just say on identity and identity politics, I'd make a distinction between identity and the politics of identity, and too often we confuse the two. Identities are very important to all of us. It's how we relate to the world, not through a single identity, through many identities, but it's how we, it's what grounds us to the world, it's how we relate to each other. But one's identity is never fixed. I mean, if you were to ask me, who am I? Who am I to this audience is very different to who am I to my daughter. How I describe myself as being to my daughter would be in a very different way. What I feel about myself is. So identity is hugely important. But that's not the same as the politics of identity. The politics of identities takes those identities and gives them a political form. It says it is because you are white or Muslim or black or Jew or whatever that it is out of that sense of being that your values and your politics arise. And too often these days, being Muslim or being white or being black or being Jewish or being gay and so on appears to carry with it a package of values, a package of beliefs that you have to hold on to. And so rather than our values shaping our identities shape our values. And that, to me, is a real problem. That's my critique of, at the heart of my critique of the politics of identity.
I want to take a small issue with this here, or not, just for clarity. I think I agree, but I would say that on the left, you have very little of that in an explicit form. There are very few that make assumptions, manifest assumptions of what package of opinions or whatever are expected from the left. However, there are tacit assumptions that follow anyway, and sometimes it's more like, I would say that the strategies it's been a hot topic in Sweden for the last 10 years, I would say. Separatism, for instance. I'm essentially quite agnostic about essentialism, about separatism. It depends on the context. What does it relate to? But it does come with a kind of be careful with what you wish for, because if you want to solve something in a separate form, which could be ad hoc relevant, it could continue to live indefinitely. And that's the kind of the few times that I've organized myself in different, like, say, African Swedish groups or anti-racist groups, the blessing has been that it's easier to agree to disagree once you've separated, because you don't have to do it as a minority group in a public sphere. But if you're going to have that as a catch-all form of organization and never be just a regular union member or member of a political party or in cultural activism in general, a broader sense, then it becomes the separatism will lead on towards a kind of essentialism in all but name.
Can I just, I mean, they're kind of, both your points are quite interesting, and again, I think we kind of agree but disagree. On this question of the left and the idea that the being comes with being a particular identities come with a package of beliefs. One of the interesting expressions, embodiments in our debate in Britain today is that in recent years we've had a high number of black or Asian cabinet ministers. We've got a prime minister who's of Asian heritage. We've had 2 or 3 home secretaries who are of Asian or black heritage. We've had chancellors of exchequer, finance ministers who are of black or Asian backgrounds. And one of the arguments that really comes up, and I know because when I challenge it, I get so much pushback on social media. It's the idea that I don't know if you know Suella Braverman. She was the Home Secretary in Britain, who was
left quite recently.
Yeah, well, that's right, and who has most obnoxious policies when it comes to immigration. And many on the left would say this is a betrayal. This is a betrayal of her background, of her history, of her heritage. And my point is that that's mad. She is a reactionary, and she is expressing reactionary views just as somebody who is white would express reactionary views. You don't have to go to India to recognize how reactionary brown people can be. The idea that somehow minorities who are not who are reactionary or who don't go along with what is seen as the right policies are somehow are somehow betraying their identity in a sense. It's a way it expresses itself. But one of the points I make in the book is about Kanye West and the way that his idiotic comments about slavery was seen not as idiotic and reactionary, but as a betrayal of his blackness and of someone trying to be white, as if we haven't got a whole history of reactionary blacks as well as progressive blacks. And that's the way this kind of notion that one's identity leads to a set of values, and that certain people are betraying those identities by assuming take on different values. That's the way it expresses itself on the left.
Just to clarify,
yes, short. So
I agree with that. Of course, that is wholeheartedly reactionary. My point is more that it's not a socialist idea, but in a more broad sense, yeah, you could find that on the left. Second, it just stems from a really skewed view of what representation should be, in my view, because I think anybody, a reactionary, Bengali person or a progressive Trinidadian or whatever should be able to be an MP or whatever, or riksdagsledamot in Sweden. But we have to understand what is it they're representing. Well, they represent a constituency or a chair or something. They're not representing on the basis of their ethnicity. And then just a small crux, the point that the sort of identity set gets half right is that they should have just an equal chance of representing, but they shouldn't represent a weird ethnic caricature. They should represent an opinion or they have a mandate.
And beyond that, beyond that, I think part of the problem is that we've conflated diversity and equality. That we've come to see a diverse society or diverse institutions somehow bringing about equality. Diversity is good in the sense that you want your institutions, especially institutions of governance, to reflect the society that you are. So in that sense, diversity is good. But diversity is not the same as equality. You can have a more diverse society, as we have now, which is also more deeply unequal. And that part of the problem is that we imagine, we've kind of lost our notion of equality and transformed it into diversity. This is probably more true of the British-American debate than it is about the continental debate, but I think it's also part of the continent, and it's becoming part of the continental debate, and that's important to challenge.
A rainbow coalition of gated communities.
Yeah. We have only a few minutes left before I will hand over to the audience, but I have to just also in relation to what happens right now. In the book, you also include anti-Semitism and argue, speaking of critical race theory, because of its focus on white privilege, it tends to be blind to anti-Semitism and as a particular form of racism. And from an identitarian perspective, Jews are cast as examples of white privilege rather than victims. And for example, Whoopi Goldberg's comment a few years ago is an example of where that blindness to anti-Semitism can lead. Can you?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say before I kind of discuss that is to say that anti-Semitism primarily comes from the reactionary right. It doesn't come from the left. But there is anti-Semitism on the left. And we shouldn't confuse the fact that anti-Semitism comes primarily from the reactionary right with the idea that there is no anti-Semitism on the left. There is anti-Semitism on the left. And one of the reasons there is anti-Semitism on the left, or rather blindness to anti-Semitism on the left, is that racism has come to be seen as a matter of white privilege. And because Jews, forgetting the fact that Jews come from Ethiopia or India as much as they come from Britain or France or America, the Jews have come to be seen as white and privileged. And therefore, so many people are kind of blind to anti-Semitism because they're a bit blind to the idea, because Jews are supposedly white and privileged, so they can't suffer from bigotry or discrimination or racism. And that's a real issue. The Whoopi Goldberg episode was a classic example of that. Do you know about it? Do you know about the Whoopi Goldberg? Oh, Whoopi Goldberg in a discussion about the Holocaust and the portrayal of the Holocaust, where she was very sympathetic to what Jews suffered in the Holocaust, and she was in fact criticising the attempt to censor that story. Nevertheless, she says the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Germany was not about black and white, so it was not about racism. It was white people fighting among themselves. And this idea that racism is only black and white. That when it goes out of the frame of blackness and whiteness, that when it's white people fighting among themselves, that somehow it is not racism or of a lesser quality than racism in a black and white sense. That's a kind of it is held by so many people. A British politician, she was one of the first black MPs in Britain, Diane Abbott. She made similar kinds of comments about the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. So it is necessary, I think, it's one of the it is one of the problems of looking at racism in black and white terms, and to see racism as a question of white privilege, rather than in a much more. There are other issues with the problem of white privilege, but this is one of them. That it makes us often blind to racism that doesn't fit in that category. Yeah.
Can I say something? I'm just thinking about the whole rhetoric of privilege in itself. To me, is I mean, I'm a bit allergic to it, I guess. But the worst form I think I get to see, especially I guess on the social media, is when people say, check your privilege. And that could be whatever privilege. And I'm not saying that people do not have certain privilege, but it's such an idealistic view of how people see themselves, because you cannot see your privileges by looking at yourself. You can only see that I have a certain advantage in comparison with somebody with a disability or with somebody that's being harassed, etc. If I look at them, you have to look outward into society and see others, and you can use your privilege even in a solidaric way. But there's a kind of narcissism with this whole mantra about check your privileges. And it also assumes that everybody agrees on these set of hierarchies, which there's a great disagreement about. And then about anti-Semitism, I also think that one problem is that since people were literally racified as Jews in the Third Reich and all the countries they dominated, Jewish people, even before that, of course, during anti-Semitism in the early 20th century, etc., assimilationist tendencies to try to hide that we differ were exacerbated. In a way, that was an anti-racist strategy, to not stand out and to conflate then that, oh, you are white or white passing, because they survived by being white passing. It's kind of, that's a bit aggressive.
I promised you time, but I just want to make a reflection. When I prepared, when I knew that we should talk to you, and I was planning to make it to a question, but we can't do that now because the time is running out. And it has been an illuminating 50 minutes. But I did a reflection. Normally, often these kinds of issues and questions tend to create really tension. But when I talk to people and ask about you, from the left to the right, everyone seems to love you.
I wish that was true.
And my question actually was, why? Why? No, but it's hard for you to answer. But it's a reflection, and it's a reflection I made because normally it's so polarized about these kinds of questions. But
you should see.
But it's interesting, wouldn't you say?
You should see the Twitter response.
Okay, okay.
That will
Pandora's inbox.
No. Okay, I won't. I'm not on Twitter. But as promised, we have a few minutes, and
ja, räck upp handen om ni har en fråga.
All set? Thank you for the discussion. I usually describe myself as a hardwired optimist. It's getting increasingly difficult to maintain that going forward. And what I've heard, actually both of you describe, is a sort of an evolution of the us and them definitions over time, from class to race to culture. Given what we're looking at in the US and in the not too distant future in elections in Sweden, I wonder how you apply these distinctions going forward and in a way that takes that universalist ideal and reformulates the us and them questions.
I'm not opposed to us and them, but it depends on the basis on which you divide us and them. I mean, when it comes to racism, there is definitely an us and them, as far as I'm concerned. When it comes to class politics, there is an us and them. So I'm not opposed to us and them. The point is that having divides, on the basis of politics, creates an us and them, but it also creates the possibilities of both overcoming the kind of fissures that normally divide us of race and gender and so on, and the possibility of negotiating to a better place to be. But if the basis of us and them is culture or identity or race, then no such negotiation becomes possible, because you are of this race, you are of that culture, you are of this identity, and therefore negotiation by definition becomes that much more difficult. And at the same time, what rooting us and them in cultural or identitarian terms does is that it actually creates deeper fissures, the kinds of fissures that we should overcome, the kinds of divides that we should overcome, but it sees that as something to celebrate rather than something to overcome. So it's, people often talk about polarization. The problem isn't polarization, it's the basis on which the polarization takes place. America was far more polarized in the 1960s than it is today. The problem is that today's polarization is on a basis that makes it very difficult to have a political dialogue about how to move forward. Much the same is true about Britain and probably about a lot of Europe. So the problem isn't us and them a polarization, it is a basis on which we make those divisions that's important.
Yes, I saw another.
Two questions. One very quick logistical one. Will you be signing books after this? Fantastic. Thank you for that.
I think so, anyway.
Great. They're back there for anyone who wants them. I was wondering, jumping on board with this the celebration of cynicism, or it is easy to be pessimistic during these times. A lot of what you say reflects on, and you spoke of your own background. When you were growing up in Britain, you saw a visceral racism. Is there not a danger now of the past is very much present? We are in Sweden. We've seen dog whistle politics from the far right being mainstreamed in the form of them being the second largest party in parliament. We've seen it in Britain with Suella Braverman, you mentioned, and we see similar discrimination, feral discrimination in India, politics coming up. Is there not a danger that we are witnessing weaponization of the very racism that you are saying has been left in the past, and it is very present now? It is far more mainstream and accessible than it may have been in the past, and it seems to be quite acceptable, far more than it should be.
I think there are a number of different dangers here. I mean, the first is the way that on the right, far-right arguments have become part of mainstream arguments about immigration, about Muslims, about the Great Replacement theory, about white homelands, and all those on the right who are hostile, or say they're hostile to identity politics, are quite happy to cling on to, or to promote identity politics so long as it's white identity politics. And part of the problem, I think, of identity politics, the mainstream of identity politics, is that it has allowed the right to rebrand racism as white identity politics, or straightforward as identity politics, and that's a real issue. And then on the left, part of the problem is that the way that many on the left, social democratic parties, think that we should challenge the far right is by adopting their policies. And the only consequence of that has been to make the far right, more popular, because, you know, why have a pale version when you can have the real thing? And so there is a real necessity on the left, among social democratic parties, first, to challenge the far right on questions of immigration, on the questions of Islam and so on, but also at the same time to restore class politics, because one of the key shifts over the past 30, 40 years has been the withdrawal of social democratic parties from their traditional working class constituencies. And what you have now is a kind of new form of mass reactionary politics, where a reactionary form of identity politics based on hostility to migrants and Muslims is married to a kind of politics that the left used to believe in, on jobs, on welfare, on hostility to austerity, and so on. So it's a kind of new kind of mass reactionary politics of which we should be very wary.
Isn't it also a kind of shift of a huge working class constituency that was white felt represented, and now all of a sudden, as the Social Democrats have retreated from the positions they were holding, someone else steps up to fill that void, and, well, we can represent you not as workers but as whites. And if you don't challenge them and say, no, this way is better, justice, welfare, etc. for all is better than this piecemeal tug war.
Yeah, I mean, class has become, I mean, part of the process is that class has become a cultural notion as much as an economic or political notion. So what defines a working class is their culture rather than their economic or political position. And so something like the phrase, the white working class, the whiteness seems to matter more than the class location of those people. That's an issue, yeah.
I think, okay, two.
Yes, thank you for a lovely conversation. I just wish you could get more time to talk, because I would really enjoy that. Coming from a millennial and thinking, you know, about how we talk about anti-racism, and here in the Swedish context we talk about equality a lot, and think about the Whoopi Goldberg comment, for example. Coming from like a Swedish younger perspective, my instant question was, or reaction was that, okay, she lacks an intersectionalist type of perspective, right? Because her like view about inequality is quite basic, if I may say so myself, right? Because she lacks certain perspectives. You haven't really talked about intersectionalism here today. I'm just really curious to get your 2 cents about it.
Sure.
Thank you.
I see intersectionalism as sometimes useful as a description of the world. The problem is that it's seen as a prescription, and it provides no prescription at all. And often the description is problematic because it kind of fixes identities, we all have multiple identities, but identities become fixed. So yes, I mean it's useful insofar as it describes the world as it is. It tells us nothing about how to change it.
Yes.
Democracy is having a backlash in the world, a major one. Just yesterday we heard Senegal is probably on their way, losing one of the most stable democracies in Africa, is also having a backlash. What is your reaction to that? What is your reflection? Just, I'm curious.
I think part of the problem with the way we think about democracy is that on the one hand you have this perception that if people don't vote the right way, then the problem is democracy, not the policies that you have that lead people to vote, not vote for you. And you can see this in the kind of, the liberal argument about democracy is that, the working class are voting the wrong way and therefore the problem is democracy. Or the problem is the working class, not the problem is you yourself and the policies you're putting forward, the kind of social transformation that you want. The other side of it is that because many people, not just working class, but kind of many people feel abandoned and voiceless, and feel that they have no capacity to change the world. They have no mechanism through which to change the world. In those circumstances, not a demagogue, but somebody, a kind of strong man, who can change the world, seems a more preferable solution to one where nothing seems to be able to change and you are left out of it. So it's kind of the problem for democracy, the critique of democracy or the attack on democracy comes from both sides. And in a way, what I'd say is that fundamental to all our politics is the necessity for democracy. That without democracy we have nothing. And the point about democracy is that it may go the wrong way. That's what democracy is. But then the problem is you, not the people who are voting the wrong way. If you can't convince enough people to vote what you see as the right way, then the problem is you. And that until we recognise that, the problem of the left losing influence among voters is because of the policies, because of the refusal of the left to take seriously, social democratic parties, to take seriously the problems facing working class people over the past 20, 30 years. Until we recognise that, then we're not going to sort this problem out. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much, and thank you, Nathan, and thank you.
Yes, so Kenan, you may take a seat over there, and we will be...
He's a loved man, so...
Yeah, please.
Everyone.
And yes, you may also make a line over there, and we will help you out with the book. Thank you so much, Kenan, Sara Kristoffersson, Nathan.